Good afternoon again. My name is Kim Johnson. I'm the Vice President of the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading. And welcome back to our first in-person luncheon program in 2.5, 3 years. Yay. Welcome back. Also, welcome back to our new location. I think things are going to work out well here, so I hope you enjoy your food and enjoy the location. I'm standing in today for our president, David Bean, who's a little bit under the weather today, but we did want to at least send his regards and also let you know that he is our luncheon sponsor today, and he's sponsoring this event in honor of one of our past board members and friend, Sam DeWald. I'd like to welcome some of the schools that are with us today. We're so happy to have our students back with us, and they are Muhlenberg. Where are you? Muhlenberg. Penn State Berks. Topahaken. And Wilson. You guys got to tell your fellow school districts we need them here for luncheon programs. Today, we're happy to have back one of our speakers who's done several of our virtual presentations and has done live presentations for us before, Dr. Randy Newnham, who will be speaking today on how the war in Ukraine has changed the world. Dr. Newnham received his bachelor's degree from the Penn State University, his master's and doctoral degrees from UCLA. He's been teaching at Penn State Berks since 1995 and has several subfields in political science. He has published more than 25 articles, and his book, Deutsche Mark Diplomacy, focuses on the role of Germany, economic and finance in shaping the ties to Russia and Poland. At this time, Randy is also a member. What's going on? Randy is also a member of the World Affairs Council Board, and it's my pleasure at this time to welcome Dr. Newnham to the stage.
So welcome back, everybody, to live programming. After I looked, it was just about exactly 2.5 years since we had our last live program, I think March 13th, 2020. So that's a long time, and I'm glad to see that you all stuck with us, and we have a good group for this return to live programming. As you probably know, we're planning on doing a live program like this every month from now on, and we have the next several scheduled. I'm sure that at the end of the talk here, probably they'll remind you of some of the upcoming events. We're also still hoping to do a virtual program every month, too, so we'll have that variety, and we have a great lineup coming up, and I hope that our loyal supporters will stick with us and renew your memberships for this year. That's also very important. So, okay, after that little commercial announcement. So, the war in Ukraine and how it has changed the world. The one piece of good news I can give you is that you're living in a historic period, you know? Although that's not always a good thing. There's a famous saying that they say that this is an ancient Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. And we do live in interesting times. What it seems to me we're seeing is the start of really a new world era. So that makes this very significant. When I teach my international relations classes, I divide recent history up into kind of large chunks of time. There's the Cold War era, there's the post-Cold War era, and I think we can now pretty much say the post-Cold War era was from about 1990 to 2022. So, you've just entered a new era. So that's the good news. The bad news is I'm not sure how much we're going to like this new era, but that's what we'll be talking about today. So what I'm going to look at is a couple of major factors in which the war in Ukraine has changed the world. And first, let me say the reason I'm doing this kind of broader outlook for how the war in Ukraine has changed the world is I've already given a couple of talks, I think even to this organization, on the immediate history of Ukraine, the current events of the Ukrainian crisis. So I wanted to look more broadly at how this impacts really much broader trends in the world. And I'm going to look at a couple different areas. First of all, kind of in terms of military and strategic thinking, how are we in a new world? And then I'm going to look at in terms of economic and cultural thinking, how are we in a new world? And in both of those areas, there's a lot of changes that have taken place in the last few months. First of all, in military and strategic terms, a lot of people have said, well, we're now in a new Cold War, or we're back in the Cold War. That's a common thing for people to say, especially people my age and older. So, you know, some of you who remember the Cold War quite well, that's an easy thing to say, well, we're back in the Cold War. Not really. It's not the same. But that doesn't mean it's not bad. It is sort of a new Cold War with Russia and quite possibly with China. A big strategic transformation that seems to have taken place in the world is Russia and China seem to have moved from the status of non-friends, which is where they already were before this. I mean, I don't think we were kidding ourselves that these are our friends, but they were at least not enemies up until now, and they seem to be moving more into the list of enemies. And that's a very serious development. And I'll look at that both in kind of in Europe and in Asia. So first looking at Russia a little bit. You know, as we of course know, Russia has invaded Ukraine, obviously taken over a large chunk of Ukraine, but also a little more quietly effectively occupied Belarus as well, who were a country that was already allied with them, but they now seem to have a strong permanent Russian troop presence, and they're flying combat missions from Belarus, they're launching missiles from Belarus, so effectively practically annexed Belarus in sort of rebuilding the Soviet Union a little bit. So that seems to lay down, you know, one side of a potential Iron Curtain. And then on the other side, maybe a more positive development is that we've been seeing NATO and the European Union step up very firmly to say, you know, this far but no further. So that side of the curtain is being dramatically strengthened. There's a lot of troop increases and much more military spending in the European countries who kind of thought the time of conflict was over, and now they're changing their minds. As many of you know, Sweden and Finland have joined NATO, which is a huge change in Northern Europe. Moldova may follow. Ukraine is hoping to get a membership path to both the EU and NATO. So we do seem to have something that looks like an Iron Curtain again in Europe. The good news is it's a lot further east than the old Iron Curtain. I'm seeing my friend Carl Tretton sitting up front here, and I just was over visiting Carl a few weeks ago, and we had an interesting conversation about his time when he was stationed in Berlin at the time the Berlin Wall was being built. And Berlin is now, of course, you know, many hundreds of miles on the good side of the Iron Curtain. If there is a new Iron Curtain, it looks like it runs along the Russian border, with Belarus being on the Russian side, maybe through Ukraine. But the very fact that we're talking about, you know, combat east of Kharkiv with most of the Ukrainians on our side is a huge change from the Cold War, of course. Much, you know, in our favor, with Russia in a much, much weaker position than the Soviet Union was in the Cold War. So that it could be seen as a good thing, although, of course, the fact that we're having this confrontation at all is not a good thing. But on the more negative side of the ledger, we all know China has become a much stronger power in the world over the last 30, 40 years. Those who remember the Cold War know that at least for some of the Cold War, there seemed to be a Russia-China partnership that we were very concerned with, the old East Bloc, but it was always very clear that Russia was the senior partner and China was dragging along behind. Now it seems like it's a little bit the other way. I've seen some pieces that are talking about, Russia's really going to become a vassal of China, which is maybe a little exaggerated, but for the Russians has got to be a huge step down from the place they'd like to be in the world. But, this rise of China is a huge factor in the world, and we have a lot of danger of conflict with China, just as we're having this conflict with Russia. Of course, as many of you are aware, Taiwan is a big flashpoint, and disturbingly in some ways similar to Ukraine, which is why, a lot of people are so worried. Of course, in both countries' cases, both Taiwan and Ukraine, these were friendly countries, but claimed by another large country, with Putin saying, well, Ukraine really should be part of us, and China, of course, saying, well, Taiwan should be part of us. But in both cases, there was an implication that the West might defend this country, but not really clear. Will we or won't we? And of course, Putin called our bluff on Ukraine and invaded. And what's to stop China from doing the same thing? Is there any real guarantee for Taiwan? And if not, might not China just decide to do sort of the similar thing to what Putin did? So in terms of broader strategy, one of the big questions, I think, for whoever ends up running the United States in the medium or longer term is, can we keep Russia and China apart in some ways, rather than have them become a very close alliance against us? Is there still a chance to keep China perhaps in that non-friend category? Where they're not really a friend, but they're also not really an enemy. I know recently a line that you've heard out of Washington is that they're a competitor. A competitor, which sort of implies like Hertz and Avis, or something like that, not like the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So could it be a friendly rivalry, or at least a not military rivalry? However, it does look like, with both the developments in Russia and the developments in China, that we're going to have a lot more military spending. I mentioned already Europe is ramping that up very considerably. The Germans, who were very reluctant to do much military spending, announced a 100 billion euro commitment in the next few years to increase their spending. And we may be pressured to do that as well. So it looks like more military spending, more worldwide competition, hopefully at least remaining as a frozen competition, kind of like the Cold War and not World War III. But even if it doesn't come to that, still a very ominous development and sad development, because so many of us hoped after the end of the Cold War that we would have a dramatic peace dividend where we could greatly reduce American military spending, where the Russians would reduce theirs, other countries could reduce theirs, and that now looks like it's not happening, and kind of at the worst time for the world, when we have such needs to combat the pandemic, to combat climate change, global poverty, and so on. We're going to be instead diverting all these resources to more military spending. There's a famous quote from Eisenhower that I'm probably going to mangle, where he basically said, in the final analysis, every dollar spent on the military is a theft from people who need food, people who, need resources for other things. So that's, an ominous development. So in kind of the military strategic world, it looks a little bit like some kind of a Cold War, different from the last one, but similar in some ways. Then I wanted to look a little bit at kind of the economic and cultural side, too, where we're seeing kind of ominous developments as well. We've lived in a world of economic globalization for now 40 years. That's been a big watchword. We have a course at Penn State on globalization, where, we've just taken for granted that we're all in one big happy family, at least in terms of money. Everybody, countries may not agree with us on everything, but they certainly agree with us on money. So, people who run businesses around the world just took it for granted that they could have, this built here and that built there, and everything would come together seamlessly and everybody would cooperate. I mean, some of you may know this, that for example, the latest jetliners built by Boeing, half of the components come from overseas. And that's one of our flagship American industries. Many of you know, for example, that we're having trouble producing enough cars because, where are the semiconductors? Where are the, other parts that might come from overseas? So this easy kind of reliance on globalization seems to be ending, and we seem to be moving toward an uncoupling from some major parts of the world economy. Russia, for example, we're clearly breaking away from them. You all know that there's been a lot of sanctions imposed on Russia over the Ukraine issue, but what's interesting is a lot of Western private companies, even when they weren't required to by sanctions, have just said, we're just leaving. We're not going to try to stay in the Russian market because it's just not going to work. Whether that's for moral reasons or just practical business reasons because they think it'll probably be cut off soon anyway, but seeing things, for example, like all the McDonald's closing in Russia was a huge thing to somebody, because I remember I was in grad school when the first McDonald's went up in Russia, and how amazing that was to see. For the younger folks in the audience, you're probably like, so what? But the idea of seeing a McDonald's on Red Square was like having a space alien standing in the White House. It's just like, what? It's just, incomprehensible. And another interesting thing, I've read some articles on this in political science, that, it's a point of fact that there's never been a war between countries that have McDonald's. Because it makes you part of this common global community. And so at the end of the Cold War, people said, great, the McDonald's revolution is taking place here. And so that makes it seem very ominous that they, of course, have pulled out of Russia. And so we lose that symbol where we thought the post-Cold War Russia was basically a normal country, was basically a peaceful country. Even for a long time after Putin, when we could see they're not really going to be a liberal democracy, still, they've got McDonald's. We're tied to them in significant ways. That was not the case in the Cold War. And now you see that breaking down. And also, sadly and very ominously, similar sort of thing seems to be taking place with China. Slower, because there hasn't been the dramatic, imposition of sanctions or something. But it's very interesting that when President Trump imposed a lot of tariffs and restrictions on trade with China, initially most of America was like, what the hell? Where did that come from? Oh my goodness, Donald Trump. And in fact, most of that has stayed in place under Biden, which kind of shows it's become a new consensus. This decoupling from China. And so what you're seeing is the global economy dividing on political grounds, which is something we had in the Cold War, where, there's maybe significant parts of the world where it's like, we don't really trade with these people anymore, or a lot less. So, where does that leave us? That creates big problems for us. It's a big reason why we're having the inflation now. Immediate impact on inflation, as many of you know, a very large factor in that is the huge increase in energy costs caused by our sanctions on Russia over the war in Ukraine. And that has rippled through the whole global energy market with the high gas prices, et cetera. But also, we're seeing a big spike in food prices. Those of us on the World Affairs Council Board of Directors were dealing with that, planning this meal, because it's very hard to have a good price for banquets anymore. And of course, many of you know what's going on at the grocery store, and a lot of that is also linked to the Russia-Ukraine crisis. But longer term, which is worrying, in the medium and long term, we're going to continue to have inflationary pressures, because if we're cutting ourselves off from this large source of supply, that really changes things, especially China. Because as you all know, we have relied so much on cheap Chinese imports. I mean, one of the things I always tell my students is just go to Walmart, walk down the shelves, and just look at where the things are made. Something like 90% of Walmart's suppliers are in China. What happens if we start to significantly cut back on that? Where are the cheap toys and the cheap shirts and the everything going to come from? Maybe we can find some new sources, maybe not. But I think that globalization really helped hold down prices for 40 years. Because, places like Walmart could always say to their suppliers, go find a cheaper place to make whatever you're trying to sell us. And they could hold down or even drive down the prices on a lot of these products. And that's not happening anymore. I mentioned the supply chains. With these breakdowns in supply chains, will you be able to get some of these products at all? Or if you do, they'll be more expensive. And then that ripples through the economy. If Boeing has to get the parts of its plane from a more expensive supplier, that means more expensive planes, more expensive plane tickets. Same with the cars you drive and so on. And this becomes kind of a long-term pressure if this breakdown in the world, splitting up of the world economy continues. And it's worse for the rest of the world. If we feel sorry for ourselves, look at the poor Europeans. As I hope many of you know from following the news, Western Europe is looking at a pretty cold winter this winter, as the Russians cut off gas and oil supplies to them, and a lot of countries had really come to rely on that, unfortunately. The third world, a number of countries in the third world are really looking at running out of food, because when the prices go up dramatically, we can still afford it as a country. They can't. And so there's already been significant food shortages in a lot of places in the world. So, military strategic terms, we have kind of an ominous new world. Economic terms, perhaps a more ominous world. And even in these kind of intangible things like culture, it feels like a little bit of an end of an era. People that came out of school with me, came out of grad school or undergrad with me in the 1980s, had this world open up to them. And I have friends, for example, who have built their whole careers on jetting back and forth to China and jetting back and forth to Moscow, because that seemed fine for the longest time. You could work in New York, you could work in London, you could work in Moscow. What's the difference? Well, now there's a difference, And we're seeing that in some of the kind of dramatic cases like Brittany Griner, the women's NBA star. For the last 30 years, sports figures have taken it for granted that, of course, American women's basketball players can play in Russia. Of course, Russian hockey stars can play in the NHL. There's no problem there. And now there's a problem. I mean, one of my students who's here came to chat with me the other day about Russian hockey stars in the NHL, and some of them are being called home. Or Putin is literally asking some of them to come home and join the army. And of course, they're not real interested in doing that when they could be making $5 million playing for the Washington Capitals. But just the fact that that would happen really kind of starts to feel like the Cold War again. And we're seeing kind of the sad results of this tension that we're now having with Russia in the careers of people like, for example, Russian opera singers and Russian classical music directors are being told in Europe and America, you had better repudiate what Putin's doing or we're not going to hire you. and that cuts off that tie. And of course, it's tragic for some individuals' careers, tennis players being boycotted, that kind of thing. Going to have a lot of impacts. I mean, one of the impacts we're concerned about at Penn State is all of our college students that we've gotten from China. It's a lot of American colleges have come to rely on Chinese foreign exchange students, and even at a small location like Penn State Berks, we had over 100 of them. I'm getting the feeling probably my time is running out. We've had a lot of these students coming through, and will that continue? I can't mention names, but I have a Chinese student who I was talking to recently who is still here in the States, and I wanted him to come to this event today, and he said, no, I can't, I'm afraid to. It's too controversial, and I said, well, you can come and make a couple of pro-China points if you want to, and he's, I can't let myself be seen there, and that's kind of sad. That's the new world we may be getting into now. So anyway, on that cheery note, I wanted to let people know that, remember, we haven't done the in-person for a while yet, so people may have forgotten this, but the traditional way that we do questions here is to write your question on one of the small cards that's on your table, and we'll have a couple of folks come around and collect those. As I see Dave is looking for questions right now, so if some of them come up, you have some already, Dave, coming in, and let people go ahead and write some of those down.
I do have a couple for us already, Randy. See if I can not create too much interference. Thanks for everybody coming out today. Who's been joining for the virtual programming that we've been doing?
Nothing? Who has been
No
joining
idea?
for the virtual programs was the question. Yes.
Right,
Good
got a
number
couple.
out there. Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Are the questions? There we go. All right. So the first question I had, listening to your presentation, Randy, you mentioned Eisenhower's reference to military spending and competition for resources. He also had commented on the military-industrial complex. Is there a possible future where military spending ever actually went down?
Yeah, well, we thought it would at the end of the Cold War, and I think it did somewhat temporarily. But you're right. There's one of our problems, of course, all the countries have this, is that, there's a large vested interest of people that are used to spending a lot on the military, and you very much can see that in Russia, for example. Among the really big supporters of Putin are the military, and that keeps throwing resources into them, and yeah.
Seems like they'd always find a way.
Yeah.
During the Cold War, prior to 1990, the conventional wisdom was that neither side would use nuclear weapons because of mutually assured destruction. Are we still confident in that assessment?
I'm really worried about places like Ukraine because since we have not explicitly put Ukraine under our umbrella of support, Russia might think they could get away with something there. And everybody seems to be very excited about the recent Ukrainian counterattacks that really have shown that, the Russian army is not as strong or well organized as we thought it was. But you could get into a very dangerous situation if they push these attacks a little further and Putin decides, why not nuke Kiev? What exactly would we do in that circumstance? Would we retaliate with nuclear weapons? I don't think we would, because we have not signaled in advance that we would. So that, that's things like that are potentially a very dangerous situation. Yeah.
There has been a lot of speculation about U.S. involvement. At what point would it trigger us getting drawn into an armed conflict directly with Russia? I think we've seen the recent Ukraine pushback. There's some speculation, rightly so, that is largely driven by U.S. training, by U.S. intelligence. Are we close to that line? Are we doing a good job of managing that? What do you think?
Yeah, it's so far I think we've signaled pretty clearly that we're not going to get directly involved unless there's an attack, say, on a NATO country, which there's worry that there could be some spillover there. One of the real concerns that like a path to escalation is will Putin get so sick of the large role being played by our weapons and supplies that he starts trying to bomb the supply corridors, maybe even starting in some place like Poland? In which case, you've attacked a NATO country, and that's an escalation that can really lead to things that would ruin our whole day, Like I say to my students in class sometimes, just remember, one nuclear weapon can kind of screw up your whole day, Yeah.
On nuclear, but not weapons,
Yeah.
even here in the U.S., we've seen some power get strained by changing weather, changing climate. There's been increased talk of should we be using more nuclear power. Do you see that same conversation around the world, and is the war having any impact on that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Germany is one of the countries I follow a lot, and it's really interesting that already probably 10 years ago, most of the German political parties came to the consensus of let's just get rid of nuclear power altogether. This was after the Fukushima accident in Japan, and they already had been leery of nuclear power in many of the countries of Western Europe, not all. Some of you might know that France is a big supporter of nuclear power, but a lot of the West European countries are very green, very environmental, also very afraid of nuclear explosions, so they had been wanting to move away from nuclear power, and the Germans had made that decision and were in the process of shutting down their last few reactors, and they've stopped that. Even though they have a Green Party in the government now, they decided they have to keep their last 3 nuclear reactors going because they just don't have enough power otherwise. It's interesting to see what's happening in Ukraine. I think some of us are probably following the kind of the drama over the big Ukrainian power stations in Zaporizhia, where there's 6 of them lined up right next to each other, right on the front lines. And of course, we're all hoping that doesn't end up in some kind of, Chernobyl times 6, which would be a bad outcome. But even if it doesn't, you take those off the grid, you've shut down Europe's largest nuclear power resource. And that's bad for things like the climate. So, it's all kind of interrelated. And, it does make a little more of a case for nuclear power, but of course, you can't make that materialize overnight, and it's very expensive, so, yeah.
And even some of the existing plants are pretty badly out of maintenance, and even that would take time to catch up on.
Yeah.
A couple of questions about, is Biden doing enough? How would Trump have handled it? I think a bridge that kind of ties it together is how does the political stability or instability of the U.S. affect Putin's decisions to proceed with this aggression?
Yeah, I don't know how much our perceived domestic political instability or instability have affected it. I mean, I think this has been mainly one of the few areas that have been pretty largely bipartisan in the reaction, with a few exceptions. But most of the people in the Democratic and Republican parties seem to have come together now. But what I think did affect, Putin's decision to intervene was probably Afghanistan. That was a big one. The unfortunate way that the Afghan conflict turned out, with both, by the way, both Trump and Biden really participating in that. I mean, Trump laid the groundwork by signing an agreement with the Taliban that basically committed us to wind down our presence, but then Biden was the one who followed through on that, and you all saw the pictures of the, people falling off of American planes in Kabul, very reminiscent to a lot of people of our pullout from North Vietnam. And I think that sent a signal to Putin that, well, if we're not even going to defend the government in Kabul, which is clearly an American ally, where there were American troops, where we spent so much time and money supporting them, if we're going to cut them loose, what are the odds that you're really going to do anything in the case of the Ukraine, where the implied American support for Ukraine was much weaker. We had, never said that we'd really send combat troops or anything. So I think Putin got the impression he could get away with that. And of course, he was also relying on bad intelligence that where he was being told that, they'd be welcomed with open arms by the Ukrainians. They were welcomed with arms, but yeah.
So if we just stick with Ukraine, is there a point in time where it might be inevitable that Ukraine would either offensively or defensively actually attack sites in Belarus or Russia?
Yeah, I think they're very wary of that, the Ukrainians, and it must be tempting because you look at like this recent collapse of the Russian forces in front of them in the Kharkiv region. You really think they could have gone into Russia somewhat in that circumstance, but they didn't. They very carefully stopped at the border because I think they're wary of the risk of this being the thing that causes a large chemical or biological or potentially nuclear attack against them. But could something like that happen accidentally is one thing I worry about. When you're in the middle of a combat situation, could maybe a unit go over the border or something, and that becomes the excuse for some kind of escalation. I guess in a way we're lucky to be having that conversation because, a few months ago everybody that's not me. A few months ago everybody was asking, when will Ukraine fold? How are they going to lose this war? And now many people are saying, well, they might actually win this war. And that's a huge change. Yeah.
We had a conversation about China a couple of months ago, and there was a question about how do the Chinese people feel about the censorship in China, and the answer was kind of, well, we don't know because they're being censored. Do we have any sense of how the Russians are feeling about the conflict right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. Unfortunately, one of the things that Putin seems to be pleased about with this war is that it's driven out a couple 100,000 Russians, which is sad. But he feels that the people who have left are basically his opponents, so great. That cuts down the leadership of anybody who might be against him. So it does seem, from what we can tell, and it's a little hard to tell, that the majority of the Russians are still behind this. But with the way Putin has steadily tightened the screws, I think the polling has gotten less and less reliable in Russia. Even 10 or 15 years ago, when Putin was there was still some independent polling where you could get what seemed to be a fairly reliable pulse on what do the Russian people really think. And now you have to look at, you get a polling result that says 75 or 80% of the people still support the war. Really? If I were asked that question in Russia, how would I answer? I'd be kind of looking for microphones on the guy who's asking me the question. So it's a little hard to tell. But they don't live in, in a totally sealed information bubble as much as China does. China has done a much better job at keeping their people well insulated from information. They talk about the Great Firewall of China. In Russia, although they've cut back quite a bit, there are still ways for especially people who know the internet to access outside news. One interesting example is that one of the large internet messaging services in Russia is Telegram, which is not one that's widely used here. And some Western news providers have said, well, if you're going to shut off access to Google and shut off access to Western, networks like that, we'll just join Telegram. Why not? So the New York Times, for example, now has a Telegram channel, and that lets them get some access to the Russian market. So there's still some possibility of having some influence there, I think. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
With respect to the tenacity and courage of Ukraine, and I think we really saw, my sense was everybody was surprised by how effectively they were able to defend themselves, especially early in the conflict. But they're now facing a long rebuilding process. Is the West going to support them indefinitely? And do you? I guess I want to they've shown a lot of strength so far. Can we expect to see that carry all the way through to past the end of the conflict into the rebuilding phase?
Yeah, they really helped their. Is that me or you? I'm not sure. Maybe. maybe turn off in between the questions. I don't know if that would help, but anyway, they really have helped their case, as you all are aware, with this recent offensive, and a lot of people think that that was partly timed in order to influence the West, because they were concerned that especially Europe, which is facing these big energy cuts, which not only will lead very likely to a very cold winter for a lot of people in Europe, but could lead to things like some industries shutting down in Europe, which then has a horrible impact on their economy. So there's been concern that, in the medium term, 6 months or a year out, countries like Germany start to say, well, shouldn't you just kind of cut some kind of a deal and get the best out of this you can, Ukraine, and get this over with? But, they really helped their case with this recent offensive that shows people that, hey, they can strike back. They still are in this thing. And maybe that will help, preserve Western support at least through the next winter. But, how long that can last, I don't know. I think there's a case to be made. This is a tough call, and, the Ukrainians are going to have to be the ones largely making this call, but maybe with some of our help, this might be a good time to cut a deal with Putin, because he is wounded, because he has been shown to be vulnerable. And maybe you can come to some sort of an agreement where, for example, Crimea, probably not coming back. I think the indications are that most of the people in Crimea want to be in Russia. So maybe tell Putin, you can keep Crimea, just give the rest back. Or, where it's going to be really hard for those Donbass region, those so-called secessionist republics, to know what did the people there really want. There were referenda that were held there, but they weren't very reliable. So, what exactly a deal would look like, but I don't know if you could cut such a deal, but anyway.
I know you touched on this during your prepared comments. There are a couple questions about the impact moving forward on non-NATO countries, and maybe specifically Finland and Sweden. Maybe they're part of it. I'm actually not sure what their official status is right now, but that group of countries, what's the expected future impact, do you think?
Well, it does look like Finland and Sweden are getting in officially soon, at least. I think you're right. I'm not quite sure where that stands in the ratification process. I know we ratified it, but I think the deal is supposed to be that all the NATO countries have to ratify before it's officially considered to be done. But that really changes things for those countries after so many decades of neutrality. And it's, makes Russia's strategic position a lot worse, because they've got, I forget how long the Finnish border with Russia is, but it's very long. It's the longest NATO border now with Russia. And that's got to be a real concern to them. I mean, not realistically, is Finland going to attack them? No, I don't think so. But Putin thinks that way. So, that creates a real burden for them. But, yeah.
So I'm going to challenge the premise of the question, but I'll read it as written. Uh-huh. Given that one of the Russian geopolitical objectives was to use Western reliance on international trade against itself, would you argue that they are exceeding? And I guess my question is that actually one of their stated objectives?
Well, I mean, they're definitely using things like the energy weapon very clearly. So that element of reliance on international trade, yes. And I think they really think and hope that will cause us to buckle. One of the big lines that they've been pushing in the Russian news media for some time is to tell the Russian people, well, you might be suffering somewhat under sanctions, but trust us, in the West, they're suffering even more, with high inflation and energy prices and so on. So they'll be the ones to give in, which I don't think we're really that reliant on them. But that, I think that's maybe what he was hoping. Yeah.
Looking at energy, we can see now Germany, France, very directly affected by being cut off from the natural gas supply from Russia. But there's also some sense maybe that Russia is selling a lot of their fuel now just through Saudi Arabia, still getting on the market. It's just not coming technically from Russia. Any impact there?
Yeah, I think unfortunately the Russians are still making a good bit of money off of this. One of the things I've heard is that their net income from oil and gas is really as high as it's ever been. Because even though they've lost the direct sales to the West, the prices have gone up so much that what they do sell, they are selling a lesser amount. I don't know, 70% or something of what they were selling before, but they are selling a lesser amount, but they're selling it at a higher price, so it's not really hurting them that much at the moment. And it's it would really be nice if we could get countries like India to back us on this, but you know, you can see why for a country like that, it's hard to turn down oil and gas from someone. So it's been a pretty leaky blockade so far.
Just a couple last questions. I know we got off to a little bit of a late start here with the lunch. This seems like kind of a fun one. What impact has Musk's Starlink satellite system had on Ukrainian comms?
That's a good question. I know that you really need to have good guidance nowadays for all these high-tech weapons, and both Russia and the U.S. really rely on GPS, and I know that you know Ukraine doesn't have its own system, so you know that might be one of the ways in which we're helping them behind the scenes is access to things like that. And I think Starlink, doesn't that do internet by satellite, I think they've been trying to use that to give access to some of the parts of Ukraine that don't otherwise have internet. So I don't know how much that's helping them there, but that's a good idea. Yeah.
I think Starlink is really starting to pick up a lot of steam on serving remote areas, so it's nice to see. Last question, as a student, what could I do to help?
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? I know there's been real efforts to help Ukraine in a lot of different ways. I've been amazed to see how much just small support things are taking place. People doing food drives and clothing drives and raising money for this or that aspect of helping Ukraine. So that is important, and just kind of the moral support too. I was surprised to see on my campus, which is not normally a large or super political campus, but this past spring they organized a nice little planting of Ukrainian flags and sunflowers in front of our student union. And so it's amazing where you see the Ukrainian flag nowadays. I mean, you drive through Reading and see it on buildings in Reading and places like that. So I think all of that helps. I mean, obviously, if you can figure out a way to send them a few more missile systems, that would help even more. But seriously, actually, lobbying efforts like that might be useful. Lobbying and demonstrating efforts to try to keep up our support of that side. But yeah, and I think we all know what the Ukrainian flag stands for now, which is nice, and you recognize it. And it also shows how important they are to the world food trade, right? I think everybody knows now that it represents a big field of grain with a blue sky. And so that's kind of what the country is like, yeah.
Well, once again, Dr. Newnham, thank you for spending some time with us today. I'll turn things over to Kim.